Chris, are you able to share our slides for tonight? And while you pull those
Yes, yeah, I
up,
can.
I'll do a quick introduction. So I'm Tim O'Reilly. I'm with Backyard ADUs. I'll be moderating tonight. And with us is Chris Lee, the president and founder of Backyard ADUs. And between the two of us, at this point, Chris, it's 5 years apiece of ADU experience. And we have learned a lot along the way. So tonight's series is part one of a two-part series where our goal is to help disseminate information and answer your questions about the emerging ADU landscape here on the East Coast. So, Chris, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
All right, let's dive right in. I will share and we'll start talking about the regulatory environment leading up to toolkits for the next session. Okay, play. Okay. All right, there we are. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Tim had kind of started an introduction, but we are Backyard ADUs. And Backyard ADUs, as Tim said, it's coming started 5 years ago. And Tim and I have kind of been here since the beginning, cutting our teeth, trying to figure out how the heck do you build ADUs in New England and make sure that they can be part of the housing mix, both to fix our housing shortage, but also just provide awesome places for people to live. Today, Backyard ADUs has grown into an expert in small home design and an expert in modular construction, and also figuring out how to get small structures permitted at scale. And we continue to wake up every day to try to make it easier for homeowners to do it, just to build more of these. Backyard ADUs has just about 40 team members, and we're building pretty much in all corners of Massachusetts and pretty much south of Augusta, Maine. Um, and we're building right now an ADU a week and hope to get to two a week by the end of the year, in order to fulfill just a small portion of Maura Healey's goal of doing 10,000 ADUs really 4 years from now. Tonight, we this is the first of a two-part series where we want to look a little bit more at the realities of permitting ADUs and getting them built post the Affordable Homes Act, post LD 2003, post the New Hampshire law. So we're dropping the ropes all over the place, supposedly making it easier to build these things. We're going to talk about what it's actually like. And then the second part series, which Liz Trice is going to come in, she's going to talk about municipal toolkits. What can municipalities do to make sure that this is easier for a homeowner to do?
And I was specifically told not to have any sneak peek spoilers tonight, but there's a lot of great tools, but also financing resources that Liz is going to present, along with some really neat bonding initiatives, looking for ways to be able to close the affordability gap. So mark your calendars for June 19th. Liz will be back with part two, and you'll certainly see that in our newsletter and elsewhere. So, Chris, when we put our heads
Um,
together to design tonight, we were thinking about, what are all the barriers we've seen doing a soup to nuts process at Backyard ADUs? And our goals tonight were to highlight basically, what are our standard processes, the things we have to do, and what do we encounter along the way? Where is there additional permitting, and what are those barriers? And then, honestly, a lot of empirical evidence and stumbling blocks to use as examples. And then we also, towards the end, have some forward-looking, what else is happening in the country with ADUs, and how might that be crystal ball for the way to change housing production here on the East Coast.
okay. So Tim, you want to walk us through some standard building permitting?
Absolutely. And this is pretty much my day-to-day job, what I wake up thinking about. is our design team designs a house and it comes to our side of the thing of the equation to say, all right, how are we going to get this done? And I always start with saying it is a team sport. And the reason we say that is backyard ADUs and no other organization we've worked with can do the whole thing. So who are we required to bring in at the outset? We're typically bringing in a land surveyor. They're helping us basically nail down our buildable area and our setbacks and making sure that everything is above board. And we use that survey not only out in the field to help with construction logistics and think about costs and constraints, but to get us through the permitting process with the town. We are building right now a lot in Metro West in the Boston area. And we're often needing additional professional services. Often that is stormwater. And then as we get into more rural localities and we're dealing with septic systems, complying with Title V, and bringing in a sanitarian or septic designer to make sure that our utilities are all accounted for. Conservation is a big one. I don't want to hammer too hard on it right now because we have a bunch of great slides later where we're going to get into the details. But if we do need a wetland scientist, those are folks we're bringing in early, collaborating with our surveyor to make sure that we have everything marked and noted on our site plan. This is on the pre-construction side. We then, of course, once we get things permitted and moving through, we have our local trades that will have their specific permits. The plumber pulls theirs, the electrician pulls theirs. Again, in Metro West, a lot of towns have a licensed drain layer list, someone who needs to pay a fee and go to a class to be licensed to lay pipes in specific municipalities. If that's the case, it's something we need to get ahead of early. We can't go into construction and then find out, oops, our site work partner is not licensed. So another piece of the puzzle to figure out earlier. Building in New England, there's a lot of old structures. And when we're doing, attachments or demos and touching existing structures, it does trigger additional things we might need. We've seen rodent inspections, hazardous material inspections. But again, we really have to hone in what is the town, what is their sort of filter and risk tolerance, and what do they require from us? So to call this standard is a mouthful. It is often a juggling dance to figure out who do we pull in when, what are our risk factors, and how are we going to, herd cats at all these steps to make sure that the process goes smoothly.
And in some municipalities, this isn't even the full list of standard permits. The municipality in Portland, Maine adds 2 or 3 more to this list. They need to see an HVAC permit. They need to see a zoning permit. The list goes on. And yeah, lots of different permits, lots of different checks, lots of different professionals in the process, making sure that things are done exactly right.
Yeah, and it's sparking my memory here, Chris, of a lot of towns care about their trees as well. So when we're thinking about
Tree.
where are we building, it needs to be on our plan. And if we're impacting anything within that municipality's jurisdiction, there's more permits and more fun. This is often one that we spend maybe 50% of our time on in the pre-design process, is figuring out how are we going to get this structure connected. You'd think we'd spend more time on the design, but this is really the crux of making things happen and making sure that our plans in the office on paper can be executed out in the field so that there's a smooth transition between all those folks, surveyor, et cetera, going through permitting so that by the time the plumber gets a plan in their hand, they're able to execute it and it makes sense in that municipality. And a challenging part of this is inspectors, and we're going to talk about this later. Inspector in town A may interpret the code one way than the inspector in town B. And has your plumber worked in town A and town B? And are we ready and prepared to make sure that we can get that unit hooked up.
Yep, that's a really good point that you were alluding to, Tim. It's the consistency between municipalities that makes this a very difficult thing to do. Doesn't necessarily impact an individual trying to build in their town, but a builder trying to build the same structure in four different municipalities may have to abide to the same electrical provision in four different ways based on the same literal interpretation. So it's an interesting parallel that ends up taking shape town to town.
And the water is an interesting one as well, even municipality to municipality, of what do they want to see? How do they want to meter their supply? And even in towns that are more strict, replacing existing water lines that are in the ground in order to bring it up to a certain standard. And those requirements aren't, posted on the front page. They're things you have to comb through, apply to permits to figure out, or in our case, cut our teeth by doing them to learn, hey, the next project in this town, we're going to need to plan extra time and extra monies to be able to execute this correctly. And Chris, let's
Yep.
talk about wells for a second, because we deal with so many properties that are in rural localities on wells. And
Yep.
it seems like it's a real mixed bag of what do we actually know about what's in the ground there and sort of
Well,
best.
wells are interesting in the sense that of all of the things shown on the screen, public sewer, septic systems, public water, and electric, wells are completely unregulated. The only regulatory body that's involved in the approval of these is basically some towns say that you must prove that you have potable water and sufficient water, and it's just proven with a simple water test from a third-party lab. And that does go to the sense there is a lot of homeowner beware. You have to figure out if your well can accommodate your needs. But there's a lot of support to do that. Well companies can help you look at that. There's lots of labs to test water quality. And a plumber is also a good professional that can help comment on whether or not you have a sufficient pressure system or well pump to provide enough water coming into your dwellings. One really interesting things on wells too, not necessarily on the regulatory side, but it's a unique thing down on Cape Cod. Oftentimes, wells are buried and they're really difficult to find. And you end up going on a scavenger hunt to try to figure out where your well is in the yard. And I think we've had some feasibility studies where we just haven't been able to find it, which is kind of, where's my well?
Yeah, and it also comes into play when the septic designer gets a plan to figure out where are all the wells on all the abutters properties, because we have to stay 100 feet away. So it can
Mhm.
become a paper chase of pulling all the records. Where are your abutters and where are these things in the ground to meet? In the case of
So I
Massachusetts.
guess specifically before we move on to this slide, just to specifically say who's going to be responsible for the regulatory on these items, who you're going to talk to in your town. Um, if you're in Massachusetts, and we got to kind of do this, we're going to talk Massachusetts and we're going to talk Maine, because those are where we're doing the most of our stuff. Sewer, if you're in Massachusetts and you're on a public sewer, more likely than not, your regulatory body is going to be DPW. And that's also going to be true in Maine. So that's who you'll be talking to look for specific requirements about connecting. Septic is going to be a little bit different. In Massachusetts, your regulatory body is going to be the Board of Health and a health agent. In Maine, it's usually just going to be the code enforcement officer. So the head honcho in the town is going to be making the calls on that. Going to water, public water, you're typically going to see DPW being in charge of your connection requirements. Sometimes you'll see an independent water company in charge of that. And that's pretty common in Maine versus Mass. In Mass, there's a lot of DPWs that oversee water distribution. In Maine, there's a lot of private, quasi-private companies that do it. Wells, as I said, there's not really any regulatory body. The plumbing inspector is going to be responsible for that water and how it's handled when it's 10 feet from the foundation, but there's not really a jurisdiction on that drilled well. And finally, electric. This is going to be basically beholden to the electrical inspector, and the electrical inspector is going to be basically making sure that from the meter behind, it's all done correctly and is meeting electrical code. It's actually going to be the utility company that's calling the shots in front of the meter. So just looking at this page, you could be looking at 10 different people that are all participating in the specifications of this and deciding what is built and how.
And in getting a hold of these folks, coordinating all these pieces can be that challenge. I think just today I had a change order come in on our recommended power supply. After 3 months of planning, the electrical company decided and say, hey, you can actually do option C. We thought only A and B were possible, but now we've come in with option C. So, and we'll talk later about timing implications of when and how long does it take to address and button up all these pieces.
So building code. I want to talk a little bit about building code. Um, it's an interesting thing. This is the area that is really supposed to keep people safe in their homes and make sure that we're building quality structures. Um, Before ragging on it too much, I'm going to say that if anyone hasn't seen it, please look at the bill just introduced in California by a California Democrat that is putting a moratorium on new building codes until I think it's 2031. Basically, what California is starting to realize, leading the country, is that building code is not necessarily about structural integrity, longevity, and safety. There's really nothing that's off limits. And when you start designing your ADU, you're going to realize this. And it creates a situation for builders and architects where it's difficult to make sure you're in compliance. And a lot of the time to make sure you're in compliance, you're just asking the building department, am I in compliance? And that individual person is letting you know if you are or you are not based on their interpretation of the code, not necessarily an engineer's interpretation of the code as it relates to the overall health and safety of the building. Um, some examples of this, just to kind of show you kind of where building code is and how it's going to impact the design of your ADU when you're working with an architect or a company to do this. The newest one that just came out, if you want an overhang on the end of your peninsula or an overhang on the end of your island, well, if it's going to go over a required outlet, you can't do it. And the justification is great. That outlet needs to be accessible. And the building code's looking out for the person that's going to have a hard time going down on their knees to get that plugged in. But you're going to have to remember that. And it could create issues with your plans, and it could be a mistake that prevents you from moving into your ADU, as we've seen it have happen. Um, GFCI outlets, there's a lot of accessibility rules around these. And it's pretty inconsistent on how building code is interpreted. So a really common one that we argue about, if I ask the question of the audience, where does your dishwasher get plugged in? The answer is under the sink. Dishwashers have to be on a GFCI outlet. The outlet's under the sink. The GFCI is under the sink. Some building enforcers don't deem that accessible enough. So they fail occupancy inspections and don't let you move in if you have your GFCI outlet under your sink for your dishwasher. Oh shoot, this is really touchy.
I think that's a great example. We've been experiencing that for several years here in Massachusetts, and it's just now becoming more enforced in Maine. So the trade-off there is again going back to scalability. Can we make a lot of housing units? You need to know what in your local municipality is going to be enforced in order to adapt to get that occupancy.
So I guess the long story on this is one of the barriers to building today. It's not just zoning. It's actually building code. It's become very, very complicated and it's touching a lot of stuff. Building code's going to have an opinion on something that you might not think it has an opinion. And it's one of the reasons why it takes so many white collars to build a house these days. Our pre-construction team is almost is almost as big as our carpentry team, just to make sure that our houses are in compliance with all of these regulations that are not just zoning. It keeps people safe for sure. But I'm also pretty sure that it's part of the housing crisis. And I'm quite glad that a California Democrat introduced that bill because I don't have to feel quite as much like Trump when I say that. So keep in mind building code. Make sure you're thinking about it as you're designing your ADU, and then also think very closely about how it's going to be enforced when you're going for occupancy inspection.
And I will plug part two of this series. We're going to look at a lot of case studies on the West Coast of ADUs and housing production. And Liz has got a lot of great data and resources to share during part two on June 19th. So Chris, this is a project we just finished and is a really great example of the pitfalls of conservation, especially in Massachusetts. You maybe want to walk us through the circumstances here, and then we can extrapolate to, housing production.
Yeah, so this is a project. This Wood Park Circle is a property in Lexington, Massachusetts. Um, this is a typical suburban lot. It's got a mowed green lawn. It's got manicured, basically garden beds. Very, very typical. It's what you'd expect. But what you wouldn't expect is that a small sliver of it is in a wetland buffer, as you can see. You can see back here with this buffer zone. Because part of this property was in this buffer zone and had the potential of creating erosion going into this freshwater wetlands, which was basically, if you looked, you could see some cattails a little bit downhill over some of this mowed grass. Um, it added, Tim, how long did a 3 month delay trying to comply with protection requirements? It was something like that.
Yeah, it's about 3 to 4 months. There was,
Um,
yeah,
it was 3 to 4 months, and you can see oh my goodness. Um, the GUI on this is not great for clicking. I was going to try to grab the annotate, but the all of these little squares that you see, these were all test pits. The municipality had us mobilize an excavator operator, a soil scientist, and they sent their conservation chair to oversee the digging of test pits to look at the soil and evaluate how well it would absorb water. $10,000 later, an entire yard dug up. We're able to start figuring out whether or not we're able to create a leaching facility that could accommodate water that hits the roof of this new ADU and make sure with absolutely no room for doubt that it's not going to flow over land into this wetland. Um, so this is one of those things that's very, very good intentioned. We're trying to protect this wetland, but in this situation, it for the most part would have blocked this ADU. We would not build this project again because of this rules if we'd known what we knew. It added almost $100,000 to the cost of this project. That basically just meant that, I mean, the homeowner luckily didn't pay that because we were fixed price and we had an agreement to do the thing. But between the additional white collars, the additional study work, is 100 grand. And it was just lucky that we had the resources to be able to find the professionals to do that. In the reality, this kind of upfront work just makes it impossible to build an ADU in areas that are impacted by a wetland buffer. And to give a little bit of I always like to compare Massachusetts versus the wild, wild west up here in Maine. In Maine, you can still fill wetlands in fully. You can fill in a lot of municipalities up to 1,000 square foot of wetlands without even having a permit. And in Massachusetts, you can't even let water run into them. So it's like, okay, that's interesting. Who's right? And I'd say it's probably somewhere in the middle. But it's definitely guaranteed to be impacting housing because a lot of the spaces that are left to build on have some kind of environmental concern to some degree, whether it's big or large. And we had two of these in Lexington at the same time. The second one, I would say, was in a more environmentally sensitive area. It was surrounded by a pretty wide realm of wetlands that were obviously wetlands, and it had conservation land around it. But that one also went through an enormous process with lots of paid professionals to make sure things were done exactly right. And it was also enormously expensive and, for the most part, would have blocked an ADU construction in what otherwise is a really good spot.
Yeah, and
All
we'll
right.
some timeline impacts of that too, of not just the work you need to do to get it done, but the pre-construction planning between these different departments.
So I think the takeaway from this, not to be too, as a homeowner, you need to double check your conservation concerns if you're in Massachusetts, no matter what. If you're in Maine or New Hampshire, you need to double check your conservation concerns if you are near a body of water, whether it's a stream, lake, or pond, or the ocean, or if you're near basically a vernal pool. Outside of that, you don't need to worry so much about this. Um, but in Massachusetts, this is something that you need to be concerned with pretty much anywhere that you live, even if you live in a suburban neighborhood.
And what do you think the takeaway would be for, municipal officials?
I think for municipal officials, the key thing here is remembering that as a conservation agent, you need to protect the resource. That is your job. But the other piece is to look at it with, I hate to use the word common sense, but have some courage to interpret the Wetland Protection Act in Massachusetts and apply it to a situation like this where mowed lawns, landscaping buffers, it's incredibly unlikely to impact this wetlands in any way. And maybe it doesn't make sense to require this many test pits to ensure the soil is identical across this property. So it's just trying to really think it through and put yourself in the shoes of the homeowner. And remember, this is a small structure that's relatively small impact. Okay. Soapbox. So more conservation. So this is some photos. This is that property. These are photos of the implementation of protecting these wetlands. So in some cases, we had to do double straw wattles to ensure we're not getting any construction erosion in. Um, these are guys carrying some of these wattles around and all of this fencing of this. You can see it's a very typical green grass residential neighborhood that we had to create a fortress around this property to make sure that water didn't escape it. Not water, water with silt in it. All right, Tim, you get to go in your soapbox on Board of Health.
Right. Well, this is one where, I'm more Massachusetts based and leaning. So I'm always up here talking about Title V and state guidance. For those of you who aren't super up to date with Title V, the department, the DEP actually just released in the first week of April their guidance on ADUs. So they went through and combed through and said, hey, these are our Title V requirements, and this is how they apply to ADU projects. So please go check that out if you haven't. It is very dense language, but it is nice to finally have some guidance on how they are viewing these additional bedrooms that are being added to properties, and how do we navigate quite literally the landscape of the backyard, of what system is in the ground, and what flow are we adding, and who and what do we need to do to connect to keep our environment safe from runoff and pollutants.
Yeah, and I can add some color here. Again, going to the Maine versus Massachusetts comparison. In terms of the regulatory burden of doing new septic or septic expansion in Maine versus Mass for an ADU. In Massachusetts, to hire a septic engineer and do a septic design, it costs about $3,000 just for the professional. And in order to get that professional to do their design, You need to hire an excavator and you need to do supervised percolation pits. So basically, you need to have a town official come to the property, oversee the engineer, observe the soils, and make sure they're accurate. So you're into this for $4,000 or $5,000
Why is there two more though?
for you. I'm sorry, daughter's asking a question about why the treats are on the table. Um, but basically you've got a $4,000 or $5,000 barrier just to figure out what kind of septic you can build before you can even get a quote on to build it. Um,
Can you fix the TV at the Sesame Street?
And I bring up this example here, this photo, not only because it's
Over
very
that.
dramatic, but this is often our route here. If we're doing a bedroom conversion or our leach field has capacity to add an extra bedroom, we're often putting in a new tank for the ADU because the requirement is you need a tank with two chambers, a dual chamber tank. Most of the tanks that are out there in the ground are a single chamber. So we're having to come in here and add a new chamber, a new tank for that ADU, which is an additional 5 to 6 grand. So professional costs up front, plus the lowest hanging fruit here for getting an ADU hooked up to a septic is typically around $10,000.
it's a lot. And going like everyone would agree that septic should be regulated so you don't end up with nitrogen loading or E. coli spills or chloroform or not chloroform, I'm sorry. Um, I'm having a brain fart. But the biggest killer of humanity of basically poop in water, and I'm blanking on the term for it. Tim, your
Giardia?
dad's a
You going
doctor,
for?
not Giardia.
Call
Cholera outbreaks. Cholera. I'm sorry, cholera. There are good reasons for this, but the tale of two states. In Maine, there's no licensure for septic installs, and to do a septic design, it only costs $700, and it's a guy with a shovel on his own doing soil analysis. Um, there's different density concerns between the two states. But there is definitely not a huge difference in septic incidents in Maine versus Massachusetts. Now Maine does have a lot of high nitrogen loaded ponds because they haven't done a good job on this. But there's not a lot of contaminated waterways from cholera or things like that. So it's another tale here. This is a huge regulatory burden for a homeowner to overcome before they know if they can afford their ADU. Um, and it may or may not be providing the level of safety relative to the amount of housing that it's preventing from getting built. So this is something that we need to think about as regulators. Again, not to put this on a negative for homeowners. Homeowners, there is a way through this. We deal with it in 1 out of 2 ADUs. It's expensive, but ultimately, a new septic plus the cost of an ADU is still cheaper than a condo and a new house in most of Massachusetts. So it still ends up being a low cost option all in with this. It just could be cheaper. And that's the point where we want to hit home here is that housing is too expensive. We need to find ways to make it less expensive. So everything needs to be on the table.
Yeah,
Okay.
and there are the Cape Cod is a really neat incubator where the pollution is at the forefront, and there are alternatives that are being pushed out there, whether it's eco sanitation or otherwise. Like, are there pathways outside of this typical Title V way that we can basically prevent the runoff and the pollution, but
Mhm.
lower the barriers to entry to housing? And so my takeaway here for municipalities and officials is just going back to that schedule, Chris, of make it straightforward and make it easy to do this. If we have a Board of Health hearing where you have to submit your designs a month in advance, have a hearing, maybe pass the first time, maybe get continued to the next hearing a month later, and then have an appeal period afterwards, you're adding 2, 3, 4 months to a project where this isn't rocket science. Like Chris said, 1 out of 2 projects involves a septic system. We're bringing in the engineered or the professionals presenting it to a town, to the professionals, there has to be a more straightforward and streamlined process to get these approved.
Yeah, and these are licensed engineers. They know what they're doing. They have professional licensure and liability on the line. They don't need to be gut checked most of the time. They know what they're doing, and we should trust them. Because if we can't trust the licensed professionals, what can we do? Oftentimes, and I don't want to disparage anyone, but oftentimes health agents are not licensed engineers, and quite frankly, shouldn't necessarily be questioning the engineer's opinion on some of this stuff. And when they do, it creates long, drawn out processes of uncertainty and additional expense that may or may not be needed. All right, that is septic.
We covered a lot of this, and I think that those Title V guidelines for ADUs that just came out a little over a month ago, as much as they are dense, and as much as I don't necessarily agree with all of them in the case of requiring, additional tanks or requiring people to design new systems, the guidance is now out there. I think the good news is, and we've seen this with the zoning aspect of ADU rules across the United States over 5, 10, 15 years, they get revamped, they get updated. And that's what, this is just version 1. I'm always sort of reminding myself that we're early. We're early here in Massachusetts and Maine and New Hampshire for ADUs. We're often sometimes coming into a town and building the first ADU. And that's, the first ADU for the planning board, for the building commissioner, for the DPW, for all these folks. And give it a couple years for hopefully the common sense to percolate through, and those best practices to emerge.
And I did a quick screen annotation there. That is a $7,000 poop pump required by Newbury. What's the other town that just required it? We just had another one, but it's this crazy specialized poop grinder. And it's completely unnecessary. I don't know what it does, but a typical system should be less than 4,000. But some towns just think you need this crazy thing for some reason. It's very odd.
All right.
All right. Oh, how do I delete that? So this is a depiction. So on the right is a list of all of the groups in a typical municipality in Massachusetts that need to sign off before you can build something. All of the things over here. It's a huge, huge list of people that get to review a project and say whether or not it's in compliance. And as you can imagine, that many opinions. I mean, look, so we just had zoning reform in a couple states. What about all this? That's wild. I mean, zoning is a tiny, tiny piece of it. Oh, sorry about the children.
Oh, no problem.
I get 1 hour here before I get relieved. Tim, do you mind talking through some of these interests?
Absolutely. And I'm just going to pause too. People have been putting some questions in the Q&A, which is fantastic. Someone just prompted to send along those ADU regs. So I'm going to send it here to everybody. You can take a look from the DEP. If my link worked well. So you'll find that in the chat. There is a question here. Any further updates expected at the state level to prevent basically towns from making it more difficult? Right now, that Affordable Homes Act that was signed into law in August, all towns need to be in compliance as of February. The reality of that is not all the towns have come into compliance, but due to the strength of that regulation, we're building ADUs in towns right now that haven't updated their regulations because that state standard has superseded local rules. So the asterisk there is low.
I think
Go ahead.
I was gonna say too. So Tim, you're definitely right. There's still a lot of like, let's get in compliance with LD 2003 and the Affordable Homes Act from a zoning standpoint. I think one of the reasons why you hear me being so like I hate to say champion about regulation, right? Is because there's no conversation about stopping the nonsense and making it easier to build housing. And every single year, there's more rules added on top. And then people continue to ask why housing gets more expensive. And we're trying to shout from the rooftops. It's like, great zoning, but stop talking about setbacks. The 5 foot setbacks, we don't need to eliminate setbacks as the next regulatory step. We need to put a stop to all of this other stuff. And we need to get our state of Massachusetts and the state of Maine thinking like California, and maybe putting a moratorium on new conservation requirements and new building code requirements, because that's what's preventing the next wave of housing from getting built, especially getting built by homeowners and grassroots. Consingley, uh, Deltec, like all of the big companies, they're going to keep building big housing. They're going to find money to do it, and they're going to get people paid. But we need to do grassroots construction here.
And
So
the
we need to cut
process
the number of special interests down so that an average person can build a house again. And we can take this from the grassroots level and make it easier just to build in general, to build that pretty good house that has been aspired to. Everyone has heard about the pretty good house in all likelihood. I would make the case that you're not allowed to build a pretty good house anymore. You're only allowed to build a super house now. Your house in Massachusetts is going to be fully net zero and close to passive. It's going to have absolutely no chance of impacting anything to do with conservation. It will be impossible to die in that house in any way. You probably can't even stub your toe. I'm being like, I'm taking it to the nines here, but that's what we're here saying. We got to cut down the special interests and make it a little bit easier for a homeowner to build a house again.
And a real challenge we see, like working through this process, hey, we submit, you pay the toll, and now you're moving through. All of these folks aren't necessarily talking to each other. We've had projects get stalled because we're waiting on a conservation review in a non-conservation district because the conservation was out on maternity leave. No one was talking in that office and covering or hitting the button. I've had to go in person at 7 a.m. when the inspector comes in the office, drinks a cup of coffee to set their schedule for the day, to say, hey, I need you to click the button on the computer on my project, because you need to click the button for it to go down the chain, whether you have jurisdiction over this project or not. So I think the takeaway here for municipalities, and I think it is also important to highlight that these online permitting systems are generally new. A lot of towns just within the past 12, 24 months, we're doing everything, in paper copies. I need 5 copies, double-sided, and a paper check. Luckily, we can now do it all electronically. So there is some, learning curve for towns to learn these systems, but there has to be some discretion of how robust, how complicated you make this online system, because it does cause delays, and it doesn't necessarily help, like Chris said, someone to permit a good house. Should I take it away with timelines, Chris? Or do you want to go for this one?
Yeah, you can go timelines. Take it away.
Yeah, I think the big one here, and like Chris mentioned, we have, our pre-construction staff is almost as big as our carpentry staff. And it's because there are so many different deadlines to hit. And in order to build scalable housing, we need to know how long things are going to take so we can plan it out. And permitting is a big one. You layer in conservation, Board of Health, additional engineering, stormwater, et cetera. All of a sudden, a typical build is going to take several months longer, 4 to 5 months in our more challenging towns in Massachusetts, unfortunately, is becoming the new norm. If we have these other hurdles, we know we need to make each stop along the way, and there's not necessarily a streamlined path. And then the other thing here is appeal periods. If we have a site plan review, if we're with the Board of Health, there is an appeal period. And then after that, we often have to still go pick up our paper copy, go get it certified, bring that paper copy back to town.
Dad.
Again, just all of these layers add more time and more cost. So it is a great sign to see online permitting happening, but we need to zoom out and say, hey, how can we really make this process more streamlined and more accessible to a homeowner to try to navigate this versus needing to hire several, white collar professionals to help you navigate these waters. I could go on and on about timelines. It's a lot of our days projecting and deadlines to be able to utilize resources and move folks forward. Chris, I'm going to hit you with a quick question. It's a great one from the audience here. Well, we're up on the soapbox hammering away and have a lot of negative examples or examples where we would like to see improvement. Do you have some examples that come to mind of positive experiences with municipalities navigating and streamlining processes? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I mean, a municipality that is a pleasure to work with is an individual code enforcement officer, building commissioner that is very comfortable making good decisions in real time and saves everybody time by not being uncertain. And they're becoming that profession is becoming a little bit rarer because it's becoming harder to make those calls. But we've had those good experiences on various towns in the Cape. East Hampton used to be one of those towns that was really good to work in. Most of Maine is really good to work in, with the exception of Portland. Portland's really tough. We have a wonderful relationship with the Biddeford building inspector, the South Portland. I mean, South Portland's an example of a town that's very, very strict across the board, but they have an incredibly competent team of inspectors and enforcers that make very consistent, quick decisions. And you can just react and make sure you're in compliance. The other side of that I would say, because I haven't said anything good about a regulation yet. I would say that Massachusetts has done a great job pushing stretch energy code. They have driven the building industry to all electric, excellent levels. And quite frankly, it has no impact on us. We've designed our houses and we're just compliant with zero energy ready all the time. And I think that's been great. And I think that's a great place to focus energy on regulatory. And it's starting to go a little bit too far. I don't know that we can get some of our houses more efficient than they currently are, but they did a great job bringing that to where it is today. But I would say that they should stop. They should stop where they are right now. We shouldn't keep pushing further.
And I think the lens there too, Chris, that we see that isn't always out there is the small home, the relatively small home, the 7, 8, 900, maybe 1,200 square foot home. How much more energy efficient can we make that versus, 2,500 square feet, 3,500 square feet? And that's where we start to tip that scale of the optimal return into the negative, where we may be required to do things that over the lifespan of 900 square feet and 1 to maybe 3 occupants goes a little too far. Uncertainty is a big piece here, especially on our end when we're trying to plan. And so, Chris, I want you to speak to the downside of this, of when there's a lot of red tape, when there's things that slow down the process or add costs up front. How does that uncertainty impact real housing construction?
Yeah, the big thing here is and ultimately general contractors are businesses. They provide a service to get money from somebody, and they use that money to pay all of the people on their team to provide the services for the homeowner. That's ultimately the construction of homes is ultimately reliant on receiving a building permit. And if you don't receive a building permit, you can't start construction, which means you can't bill for work, which means you can't pay your people. which creates a really difficult situation for building a general contracting company. So permitting uncertainty and when can I start construction makes it very difficult. That's how it impacts housing production. On the homeowner side, um, uncertain permitting timeline makes this very difficult to be a housing solution. Because ultimately, when somebody needs a place to live, they need it now. They need it in 3 months. They've had a life event that has created a situation where they need to move. And then people start shopping for houses and they buy a house. If you don't know if you're going to get a permit in 2 months or a year, you can't plan life around that. And the reality of the situation is a lot of the people that are using ADUs as a home right now are elderly people and they have health concerns. And I hate to say this, but we've actually had homeowners die before we were able to get their ADUs done. And that has happened multiple times. So it's a real concern. And when we make something like this take so long to plan, it just makes it an unrealistic timeline, an unrealistic housing solution. So we need to think of it both from like the realities of can we have businesses, nonprofit or for profit, create a system around this? And then can homeowners deal with the uncertainty of timelines of move-in? And both are equally important when it comes to permitting and consistency.
And a lot of the folks that we build for are on a fixed income. So having an upfront fixed price is crucial in terms of planning not only, hey, what are my costs going to be to build this, but what are my utilities going to be every month so I can plan. And the uncertainty or elongated timelines introduce areas where unforeseen costs come up, or like Chris said, hey, if it now takes an extra 2 months to move in, what is your housing solution and what are the costs for that gap in housing along the way? There's a really great question that came in from Phil. He said, hey, we've been here talking about Mass and Maine, but what about New Hampshire? We're just finishing up an ADU in New Hampshire. How's that experience been, Chris?
It's been somewhere in the middle, closer to Maine than Massachusetts. I think New Hampshire is in that middle zone, and honestly, we don't have a lot of experience yet to see what the situation is. My guess is Seacoast, New Hampshire, is a lot more like Massachusetts than northern New Hampshire. And that kind of goes along with a trend that we see pretty consistently is the bougier a town becomes, the wealthier a town becomes, the more difficult it is to build new things because they have more money to put more regulations into place and keep track of it. So I think if you're in northern New Hampshire, it's probably going to be just like Maine. You're going to be dealing with an individual code enforcement officer who's very reasonable. If you're in Portsmouth, it's probably going to be pretty hard, and it's going to look a lot like Massachusetts or Portland, Maine.
We actually, our homeowner in New Hampshire is on the call right now. We're going to be wrapping up her house here shortly. And last I heard, we were thinking about doing a little event there to spread the word.
Yeah, and that house went great. I mean, we didn't have really any permitting issues. We had some stuff with the septic. But the process of getting inspectors there have been great. And the last I heard, we should have the final inspection next week. So it's gone well. And that's a little bit more northern New Hampshire. It's not down on the seacoast. It's a very nice town in New Hampshire, but it's not Portsmouth. So I think it's an example of New Hampshire is probably pretty good on average.
Yeah, and I'm not super up to date on the state legislature there, but it is going to be like all of our other towns in New England where, someone wants to see it done. There's got to be those good stories out there for other towns to look around and say, hey, why don't we do this? This is a great solution. Great. Deb had a fantastic question come in. Speaking to Massachusetts, will be that, hey, the state law supports detached ADUs, although some towns may still want to fight that and insist that ADUs be attached. What do you think about that, Chris, in this emerging landscape in Massachusetts of towns that maybe don't want to adopt more lenient and across the board ADU rules? How do you think that's going to look?
There's not very many of them, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. And if they do fight it, there'll be lawsuits. So there's a justice system in place to make sure that that doesn't become a big thing. And the towns that we've had that said that have all backed down, and we're now building ADUs in them. So I think that's the initial stance, and then they realize it's not worth taxpayer money to fight it.
Yeah, and of course, local politics come into play. And I have had folks who have reached out interested in building an ADU saying, "Hey, I don't want to be that first person. I don't want to be that martyr." I think too, again, we're early. This just became required in February. So towns that maybe still are digging their heels in, hopefully in the next couple months, may see that, hey, this is real. And like Chris said, not want to get tangled up in the legal process. Great. Oh, and Cynthia, our homeowner in New Hampshire, just said that there is a pro ADU bill before the New Hampshire House right now. So last I read, New Hampshire was basically using LD 2003 in Maine, and some of the stuff in Massachusetts as a case study. So it's great to hear that bill is being moved forward.
And that bill did pass. That bill passed last week. So it's in. It made it through. It's law.
All right.
So New Hampshire.
Woo. All right. Do you want to go to our next slide, Chris? We're here at 6:00. We have more content, so we'd love for you to stay on. But do understand if you have to go, this will be recorded. If you do need to head out. And please, if you do have questions, put them in the Q&A. If we don't have time to answer all of them, we'll reach out to you personally and get those answered. So our last couple things to round this out, putting more of that municipality hat on, as it relates to those utilities. What are some best practices? What are we seeing out there? And what's going to be best for housing production? DPWs is a big one. Like Chris said, 1 out of 2 ADUs is on a septic. That means 1 out of 82 ADUs is on a sewer. And oftentimes it's town water. So we're pushing both of those through the local DPWs. We have some examples here. Every town right now, the DPW is telling us how they want to see that sewer connection and that water connection, and the costs in order to become compliant can range widely. Northampton out in the western part of the state, very pro ADU, have been very pro housing for a long time. Actually, this might be a little bit out of date, but sometimes we have to get the plumbing inspector out there to every single job to tell us how he wants to see the water connection done for that unit on every job. It's not, I've heard one thing on this job and another thing on the other. So we're at the point now where we can plan as much as we want, but we have to schedule him out there to get something in writing on how this project's going to go. And that is just cumbersome and costly. We've seen other towns take it the other way, where there's just blanket in place rules. We have a couple that we'll look at. Separating requirements, requiring meters to be moved and put in meter pits, requiring us to trench around a house versus connect in a basement, all of which may be in the name, of public health and public safety, but is often done without, the full lens of cost of not only what is this going to cost as a blanket rule, but property to property are so different. In Concord, having to trench a sewer line around an existing house and cut across a driveway was very expensive. Does it mean that their waste, travels and needs to where it go in a more effective way? No. So I would argue that, unfortunately, that a homeowner probably ended up spending about $25,000 to meet those requirements. But it was done in a bit of a vacuum. Other towns sort of have a blend, saying, hey, maybe the water can be one way and the sewer is another. Yeah. Any questions out there in the audience? Chris, I know you're probably doing a child handoff, so it's a tricky time for you. But anything you want to say as it relates to DPWs?
I think the only comment on DPW is this is one of the DPWs are the number one spot for new code creep. And Tim, I'll correct one thing that you said. Most DPWs do not have connection details on private land. Most do not. It's a trend that they're adopting rules. So they're going from not having an opinion to having an opinion. And that opinion is making it, sometimes the opinion's right, sometimes it's wrong, and it's property specific. So this is an area that we need to be very careful. And I'm pretty sure we had a role to play in this, but we lobbied for the Affordable Homes Act to take a position against this type of new code creep, and we got it into the Affordable Homes Act. And the Homes Act says municipalities cannot require separate water or sewer connections for ADUs, and that was us. We basically presented this to the state and said, "Hey, look, we're having perfectly good water lines rejected by DPWs for no reason, and they're making us cut into roads to the tune of 30 grand." The state heard us, and now in Massachusetts, DPWs can't require separate connections. They can still require other crazy stuff, but at least they can't require us to cut into the road unless we have insufficient utilities. And we have a project right now, Tim, in Shrewsbury, where the town's taking a position that's going to bite them in the butt. That's illegal. And we'll be certain to let them know that as we progress with that project.
And that sort of relates back to what we were talking about with Deb's question about towns maybe stonewalling new ADU rules is DPWs trying to, still levy their way or the highway versus that new language in the Affordable Homes Act. So.
And they're not trying to stonewall housing production or ADU production. They're trying to keep their interests safe. That's what they're doing. They're looking out for themselves and their constituents. It's just they don't have a big enough sight to see what their decisions are doing. So like the very specific rules which are protecting the sewer line and the sewer infrastructure may have a bigger negative impact on housing, but that's not the DPW's concern as an individual. So it's nothing to do with blocking housing. It's about protecting the individual interest. And we need to find a better way to make sure that all of the individual interests are aligned with the community interests as a whole. And that's the goal that we have right now as building professionals, building architects, whatever it might be, is to make sure we get that alignment.
And I think that's a great, takeaway message here for all of these different departments. Conservation, stormwater, DPW, all basically sticking to the book, sticking to what they know, without specifically, trying to stonewall housing production. All right. We have a couple more questions coming in here. Great. Chris is controlling the slides here, so I can't advance, but our next slide here is basically looking at these are some blanket prescriptions here for water and sewer connections. We're calling Concord out a little bit here, requiring us to basically replace existing lines. Part of the reason they took this stance is because they're worried about future subdivision and carving off ADUs. It's not necessarily, it is not their jurisdiction to govern the zoning, but that is basically where they've taken their stance to require utility connections. This is one of these projects in Concord. It's not fully shown here, but we basically had to do a giant new septic system, running electric lines through here, bringing a new water service to come through our ADU. This is actually shown coming around our house in order to meet not only the Title V requirements for the septic, but those DPW requirements for the water line. And we ended up having most of this property be within our cone of destruction, or having to tear it up and then put it back together at the end, which again is one of those domino effects of scope creep and cost. of not just meeting that requirement, but what is it how does that actually translate on site? Stormwater is a big one, and I know we're well past 6 o'clock here, but towns are ratcheting up their requirements for stormwater, especially in Metro West. Towns like Newton, Lexington. We showed that plan earlier with 5 test pits to assess the soils and their ability to percolate water. Is that needed? Our standard, construction standard, whether we're building up in Maine or Massachusetts, is common sense. Can we drain to daylight in properties that allow it and make sense? Or do we dig a pit, fill it full of stone, and drain to a dry well? We want to address that roof runoff, but do we need to hire an engineer and an excavator and do soil pits, test pits to generate a $5,000 plan on a piece of paper to then have a recipe for $10,000-$15,000 of work on site in order to address stormwater? So it is a real concern for the homeowner. Keep it in the back of your head. How are you going to, where is your project? If you're in Portland, if you're in Metro West, we're typically earmarking some additional funds for that. If you are in a more rural municipality, it is sort of a case-by-case basis, and using common sense is the best practice. Anything you want to add, Chris, to stormwater? This is that system in the backyard in Lexington, basically a full leaching facility just for clean roof runoff into the backyard there. And we're almost done. Fire safety is a big one. In Maine, we are putting sprinkler systems in ADUs. We are required to do that. Luckily, we are not doing that in Massachusetts. But why? Why are we doing that? Someone died in a fire. And so sprinklers are required. They do increase the chance of survival in a fire. But how probable is it that your house is going to catch on fire? Chris mentioned earlier, we're building all electric, no gas in these homes, whether it's cooking, hot water, or heating. So we're really tight, energy efficient homes. This should be revisited. We have to look at this to say, is this worth it? Is this cost on a per unit basis justifiable as it relates to housing production?
And New Hampshire has legislation that prohibits sprinklers in 1 and 2 family homes. So New Hampshire realized that this data is being used incorrectly, and they don't allow sprinklers. And again, this is not a problem in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is not doing sprinklers on single family homes. This is a Maine problem. This is a Portland, Maine problem. This is a Rockland overturned their sprinkler requirements, but this is a Maine thing.
Great. Well, so to round out part 1 here, this is the message. ADUs are easy to build. I hope tonight, whether you came here as a resident, as a state or municipal official, from a nonprofit or a business entity, that you take this away, that ADUs are great. They are easy to build. I always say the things we've looked at tonight are speed bumps along the way. They are not barriers. They do not prevent you from moving forward. But they are things that we have to approach and overcome. And like Chris mentioned, there's often, it is cost. It is cost and time. And as it relates to this housing crisis, and being able to build more housing units, we're working against the clock. We should have been doing this 20 years ago. But
yeah, ADUs are easy to build, relatively speaking. Unfortunately, they get held to a lot of the same regulations as apartment buildings, which is probably not the right path here. But our position is they're easy to build. They're relatively cheaper than everything else. So we should definitely build more of them. We should promote them, and we should do more to make it even easier. And as a theme of this, we got to think very hard about the next step in reform. We did a great job with zoning. We've dropped the ropes on zoning. What's next? And I promise it's nothing to do with setbacks. It's something to do with one of the other 10 interests. Thank you for listening to us tonight. We're out there trying to get the word out. I don't think we sold ADUs very well tonight. We talked a lot about the problems in building them, but we are building them. We're building one a week, and by the end of the year, we'll be building two a week, and we're doing our best to navigate this. So we'll kind of reach out to us with questions. If you're a homeowner with questions about how to navigate this stuff, we've got a team. We'll help you get through it. Even if you don't build with us, we'll point you in the right direction. And if you're a municipality, a planning director, a building commissioner, whatever it might be, reach out to us. We'll share our experience, and we'll try to help kind of make your town and help you do your job even better. We're excited to help make these a thing and help them build more houses.
A few quick questions for you, Chris, just before we leave.
All right.
Is it all of Maine that requires sprinklers? You mentioned a couple don't. What's
No, it's municipality per municipality. It's probably like 4 or 5 in and around Portland. It's Portland, Gorham, Saco, Rockland was on that list. I want to say Yarmouth. It's not super common, but as with a lot of regulatory stuff that has a headline of being a good idea, as one town adopts it, the next town adopts it. And that's what happened in Maine all of a sudden. I think Portland was one of the first, and then everyone else started jumping on the bandwagon. But there's legislation at the state level in Maine right now that will ban sprinklers from ADUs, and that's very likely to go into effect this year. And then hopefully that will translate into a wider spread prohibition like New Hampshire did. So we can make it easier to build safer single family homes than what a lot of people are living in right now.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris.
Yep.
Appreciate all your time and your insights. And part 2, I cannot sell it enough. Liz has been working on a lot of great tools. She's got all the details about all that work happening in Rockland, across the state of Maine, great partnerships in Massachusetts, and really that forward-thinking vision of how do we make this easier. So please put it on your calendars, June 19th, same time at 5 p.m. And we'll see you then.
See you, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Great night.